Well, it's for me a pleasure to introduce Professor Jan Wouters in the last act of this conference. As I already announced yesterday, this will be an ESIL lecture. So for those of you that are not familiarized with the European Society of International Law, let me explain that this is an initiative that allows prominent scholars to reach a wider audience by publishing in open access a lecture of excellence. This has produced an excellent collection of videos available to any person interested in international law or in European law that projects a European voice, which is very important, on some of the most important matters regulated by international or European law. I would like to thank the European Society of International Law for having accepted our proposal and including this keynote lecture in the series. And of course, I would like to thank Jan Wouters for agreeing to deliver the lecture. Professor Wouters is a very well-known scholar. He is full professor of international law and international organizations in the Catholic University of Leuven, Jamon Chair ad personam, and founding director of the Institute for International Law and of the Leuven Center for Global Governance Studies. Professor Wouters is also a member of the Royal Academy of Belgium for Sciences and Arts and practices law as of counsel in Linklaters in Brussels. He is editor of the International Encyclopedia of Intergovernmental Organizations, deputy director of the Revue Belge de Droit International, and an editorial board member in 11 international journals, if this has not changed since the last time I counted. I could go on and use the 40 minutes reserved for his lecture, summarizing his many and outstanding professional achievements, but I will limit myself to mention that he is coordinator of the Horizon 2020 project Reconnect, that is, this means reconnecting Europe with its citizens through democracy and rule of law, and this is the reason why we have asked him to be here today to somehow recap the bulk of the debates that we have had these 2 days, but above all, to give us his knowledgeable perspective on the real capacity of the European Union to enhance the rule of law in Europe and the world. So Jan, this is your mission today. I hope it's not a mission impossible. You have the floor.
Thank you. Thank you very much for your kind introduction. It's a great honor and pleasure to be back in beautiful Granada, which I visited for the first time on my bicycle at age 15. It's quite a while ago. And I also want to sincerely congratulate the colleagues for their impeccable organization of this beautiful conference. So let me introduce with some dramatic statements. Since the 24th of February of this year, the world and Europe have changed. If we had held this conference as it was initially planned 2 years ago, or even just a week before that 24th, my lecture would probably have been a very different one. The Versailles Declaration, adopted by the EU heads of state and government on the 11th of March, calls Russia's war of aggression against Ukraine, and I quote, a tectonic shift in European history, end of quote. Now, one always has to be very careful with what comes out of Versailles, which is itself a place of many tectonic shifts in European history. But this time, the heads of state and government captivated the historical momentum quite well. And that is that Russia, and I quote again from the declaration, Russia brought war back to Europe. Nous voilà. Now you may say, okay, it's horrible, but it is about a war of choice of an autocrat in the bad outside world, and that as such should not affect the internal respect for rule of law within the EU and its member states, nor the promotion of the rule of law in the EU's external action. What our discussions of the last 2 days were all about. Now, whether we like it or not, there are important linkages between what is happening with this war and those two topics. First of all, Russia's aggressive military actions, in my view, cannot be seen in isolation of the absence in that country of sufficient democratic and rule of law safeguards. We are facing a case of extremely centralized power in the hands of one autocrat who has been the most powerful man in Russia for nearly a quarter of a century, and who procured himself a law changing the constitution that may keep him in office until 2036, and who has repeatedly and also recently threatened to use nuclear weapons. So in a way, this by itself is a big wake-up call of what the absence of rule of law and of real democratic checks and balances may do with a country and with the world. Secondly, there's something else, I'm afraid, that is happening. The European Union seems to have changed too. For the first time, the Union is supplying lethal weapons to a third country at its eastern border that is the victim of a brutal aggression of the largest country in the world. The Versailles Declaration also makes clear that the priorities of the European Union for the next years will all be about strategic autonomy. Even the Macronian words of European sovereignty found their way to the text of the declaration. So it will all be about strategic autonomy, be it in defense, be it in energy, in economics, or even in agriculture. And last but not least, speaking of the changing nature of the EU, just a few days later, it already became clear that the European Commission itself is changing its priorities. It is quickly deprioritizing its actions to protect the rule of law within the most problematic EU member states. Solidarity with those member states that are now admittedly taking in millions of refugees, that is now the first priority. So, rule of law backsliding, let's not focus too much on it right now. Still, in my lecture, I will first of all try to show that upholding the rule of law within the European Union should remain a stark priority for the Union. And why? It's actually a very simple message, as old as the Bible. A house that is divided against itself cannot stand, and it can definitely not shine in the world. I will share in that respect with you the findings of Reconnect, as announced, a Horizon 2020 research program of which I am the coordinator. We have worked for 4 years with 18 partner institutions from 14 countries to analyze what has gone wrong regarding the rule of law and how we can better, and that's the full name of this acronym Reconnect, how we can better reconcile Europe with its citizens through a stronger commitment to democracy and the rule of law. After sharing with you some of our main analysis, findings and recommendations, I will return to the question of the EU's role in promoting the rule of law in the wider world. That may indeed well be a mission impossible, but again, in the light of what has happened since the 24th of February, I think there is a lasting and urgent necessity to still go for it. So let me start with the main findings and recommendations of the Reconnect project. At the center of that Reconnect research has been the disconnect that exists between the Union and its citizens. And we know for many years what disconnect we are talking about. We talk about the lack of real trust of citizens in Europe, the gap between Europe and its citizens, and so on. And indeed, there is this crisis of trust, and I think to start with, I should contextualize that crisis of trust again a little bit, and quickly revisit some of the profound changes that democracy and the rule of law are currently facing in the EU. I will touch both on democratic challenges and rule of law challenges, because I have been convinced in our Reconnect project those two are not separated. They are closely intertwined. And after that, after this contextualization of the crisis of trust between Europe and its citizens, I will touch on the tools, the toolkit, which according to our research is there and should be used by the Union to strengthen its foundational values and regain the trust of its citizens. And in doing so, I will explain briefly also how these tools have failed to provide resilience because they were not properly used. They have failed to provide resilience against the trends of democratic and rule of law backsliding which have been occurring in a number of member states. And then I will come to the final recommendations for what we consider the right way forward for the EU and its values, which are again based on the conclusions of our Reconnect research. We are now almost at the end of April the project ends, and we are really working hard to formulate those final policy recommendations and even, how unrealistic it may sound, some recommendations for treaty changes. But that will officially be launched at the end of next month. First, the crisis of trust. I don't need to tell this distinguished audience, because we have heard it time and again in our conference, that the EU is founded on a number of fundamental values, beautifully set out in Article 2 of the EU Treaty. Now, it's good to recall also that the commitment to respect, but also to promote these values, is actually a prerequisite for membership of the European Union, as made clear explicitly in Article 49 of the EU Treaty. And it is on this basis that the Court of Justice has held, and I quote from its judgment of the 15th of July 2021 concerning the disciplinary regime for judges in Poland, I quote the court's judgment: "The European Union is composed of states which have freely and voluntarily committed themselves to the common values referred to in Article 2, which respect those values and which undertake to promote them. In particular, it follows from Article 2 that the European Union is founded on values such as the rule of law, which are common to the member states in a society in which inter alia justice prevails." End of quote. This case law, interestingly, has been amply and explicitly referred to by the legislator in the preamble of the EU conditionality regulation of the 16th of December 2020. And that preamble adds to this that, and I quote, "the laws and practices of member states should continue to comply with the common values on which the Union is founded." End of quote. And this case law, as you may know, has been recently confirmed by the Court of Justice in its judgments of the 16th of February of this year in the Polish and Hungarian annulment proceedings against the conditionality regulation. There the court reiterates, again a brief quote, "Article 2 contains values which are an integral part of the very identity of the European Union as a common legal order, and are given concrete expression in principles containing legally binding obligations for the member states." The court went on to say, as we already indicated, that the rule of law is a value common to the EU and the member states, which forms part of the very foundations of the EU and its legal order. End of quote. I will not quote the court again, but I wanted to do this at the beginning of my talk because the earlier arguments that we have heard quite a number of years from a couple of member states, that there is actually no real rule of law concept in the EU, or that the notion is too vague and not consensual enough, I think we can now say these have been swept from the table by these judgments. Fortunately so. But in the current context, one has to ask the question, is the European Union and are its member states still sincerely and fully engaged in adhering to and in promoting those fundamental values? Question mark. And there I come to our finding that in recent years, the Union has faced a rather consistent trend of backsliding on both democracy and the rule of law in a number of member states. Of course, we always mention the usual suspects, Hungary, Poland, Romania, but in fact the picture is larger and more diverse. One thing is clear, this has placed the EU's foundational values under increasing pressure. Infringements upon the rule of law and democratic standards have manifested and continue to manifest themselves in a number of ways. What are the most apparent infringements? Impairments of judicial independence in terms of both national constitutional courts and other domestic courts and tribunals. Open attacks on independent media, on civil society, on independent universities, and increasing corruption and interference in public prosecutions in some member states. The Union has been criticized for its lack of willpower to adequately use the tools available to its institutions in order to tackle these forms of democratic and rule of law backsliding. It has been said that if the Union had used its current tools forcefully and soon enough, it might have been able to enforce compliance with democracy and the rule of law in member states quite a while ago. Now, let us also not forget that there are also challenges at the level of the Union itself. The EU has long been criticized for its own democratic deficit, a phenomenon that has of course been remedied to quite some extent, especially with the rise of the European Parliament as a co-legislator, but it still persists in some of the decision-making processes. There is still the criticism of the Commission for insufficient accountability, the lack of transparency, especially on the part of the European Council and the Council, the erosion of the role of national parliaments, and some other criticisms such as the lack of transparency in the negotiations and implementation of EU trade agreements. All of them, in a way, contribute to a poor democratic legitimacy track record of the EU as such. To add to this, successive crises, such as the financial crisis since 2008, the ensuing sovereign debt crisis of the Eurozone, then the migration crisis, security crisis related to terrorist attacks, Brexit, COVID-19, and now Russia-Ukraine, have in a way all contributed to eroding quite severely the legitimacy of the Union, and by association the trust of its citizens. So the essential question is, I repeat, how can the EU reconnect with its citizens? And so here I will come back later in my lecture to the global context. I'm not going to deal with that right now, but I want to highlight already that there is a global context out there in which the EU takes part. The EU is not in splendid isolation from that context with regard to rule of law backsliding and democratic backsliding. I'm going to keep that for the second part of my lecture. I'm going to highlight specifically now the internal problems that have surfaced. And they have to do with lots of things, with nationalism, populism, with intolerance also. And again, as I said, you cannot dissociate the rule of law backsliding from other problems regarding the quality of our democracies. Democracy, as we all know, is also one of the fundamental values of the EU, but our research with Reconnect has shown that actually there are amazing and significant variations in the quality of national democracies within the Union. Again, the usual suspects, Hungary, Poland, Romania, but again the picture is more diverse, right? But, and if I say the picture is more diverse, I should broaden it up to the current debates which we see in many member states as a reaction to the ever-growing powers of the European Union, which has resulted in multiple countries openly expressing their proclivity towards regaining and strengthening their national sovereignty and identity, sometimes under the guise of the term of constitutional pluralism. But this impulse, as we all know, came to a boiling point with the finalization of Brexit in January 2020, through which the UK withdrew from the EU to reclaim some of its powers, and then similarly during crises such as the migration crisis, the COVID-19 crisis, we have seen time and again member states being inclined to favor sovereign and national approaches as opposed to common solutions. Our Reconnect research has borne out that one of the most worrying aspects of the decline in democracy in the member states is the deterioration of the quality of public discourse. What do I mean by that? Well, we found out also through empirical research that none of the other components of democracy have declined as quickly and as sharply over the past couple of years as the quality and the civility of public and political deliberation. The quality of public discourse is especially influenced by the failures to adequately explain actions, political actions to citizens, but also by the way in which political opponents are being portrayed, not as democratic competitors, but as enemies or illegitimate rivals. It's very worrying. A second worrying trend, maybe even more worrying, is the withdrawal of citizens from public participation and from participation in elections. Our research has analyzed factors that affect electoral turnout both at the national and the union level. When we compared the two levels, two patterns became visible. On the one hand, our research established that, and you know this, electoral turnout in European Parliament elections is always lower than the turnout in national legislative elections. On the other hand, the lines for both types of elections run parallel, meaning that the European Parliament elections still in the eyes of the citizens and of politicians remain what we call second order elections, always second order to national elections. And you would say, well, 2019 was better because indeed we had a record electoral turnout, but the sad reality is that all European Parliament elections since 1979, the first time, have displayed a lower turnout in comparison to the previous election. I'm not going to dwell on the recommendations that Reconnect makes to try to reverse this trend. They often depend on very practical things, such as, for instance, hold the election rather during the weekend than on a working day. You know, very obvious things, but people will go out rather on a Saturday or Sunday to vote than take time away from their working day. Questions of compulsory voting. Holding national and EU elections concurrently, all of that tend to increase citizen participation. Now, I should add something to this. To assess more accurately the attitudes and the perceptions of European citizens, our Reconnect project has conducted a lot of empirical research on discussions about the EU among the citizens. How have we done that? Well, it's definitely not a legal methodology, it's political science. We have done that by organizing citizen surveys before and after the 2019 elections in 7 different member states, but also by consulting 12,000 citizens in 6 member states. We had to make choices, of course, to ask them how they think about things such as a further transfer of powers to the EU, solidarity between rich and poor member states, the role that citizens see for themselves in EU decision making, the policy areas where they would like the EU to take decisions in. And I want to briefly share with you 4 important insights that have emerged from those surveys, and which I think are really important for our considerations here. First of all, whether we like it or not, the first finding is citizens are divided over the question of transferring additional powers to the European level. They're also divided over the question of possibly repatriating sovereignty back to the national level. The option, interestingly enough, that seems most acceptable to a majority of citizens is a distribution of competences close to the current status quo. Interesting finding. Second finding, citizens are equally ambivalent regarding the idea of European solidarity in the form of redistributing wealth from richer to poorer member states. There are really great country differences on this question, and I don't think you need to have too strong an imagination to see differences between northern, southern, what have you, western, eastern countries in that respect. So that's the familiar division line between richer net contributors, the frugal countries, poorer net beneficiaries, and so on. So in other words, far-reaching reforms in the direction of more intra-EU redistribution are likely to meet with serious public opposition in some of those countries. Third finding, which policies should primarily be tackled by the EU? That's very interesting. Citizens clearly prioritize areas with an outspoken transnational character. Many policies that are favored by citizens are related to the perception of global threats. Think of climate change. Think also now of war. War is back in Europe. Suggesting that EU action could be framed successfully along the lines of what President Emmanuel Macron has called une Europe qui protège. And I would suppose that with the Russian invasion in Ukraine, this is still more the case today. Fourth finding, interestingly, there is wide support for more citizen participation and more transparency of EU decision-making processes. Citizens place high importance on the capacity of EU policies to solve problems, and they really appreciate the sharing and distribution of those benefits among all member states. Why is this also important? Because, as you all know, the EU's political system, read Article 10 of the EU Treaty, is primarily based upon the principle of representative democracy. That's like, and then Article 10 is beautifully formulated, trying to justify, let's say, the legitimacy of each of the institutions based on some particular kind of representative democracy. Not always that convincing, but it's there. Well, the question here, and I come back to that, is whether we should also maybe partially, let's say, responding to some of the experiences in the Conference on the Future of Europe, whether we could not expand this democratic universe a little bit by paying more attention also to deliberative democracy tools, right? I come back to that in a few moments. In any event, with Reconnect, we really found this survey very, very interesting, and we say, well, this really has implications for future reform of the EU. Policymakers who want to cater to the wishes of European citizens, they should, of course, first of all, strive to grant the citizens more channels of participation and improve their capacity, their ability to monitor political process at the European level. Moreover, those surveys show that framing the nature of the EU as a positive force against external threats is likely to resonate very well with many citizens. And that is maybe also what the Versailles Declaration does. Lastly, since citizens are divided over the balance of powers between the EU and its member states, I think that policymakers should probably be very careful and cautious about trying to change the current vertical distribution of power in the EU. Again, it will be very interesting to see what final recommendations are going to come out of the Conference on the Future of Europe in the coming weeks. I come to the tools to restore trust. What is this rule of law toolbox of the EU? Has the EU used it in a good way? Has it failed to use it sufficiently? Let me quickly go through that. You all know some of these things, and they have also been referred to at our conference. First of all, there are the treaty-based instruments. We've taken a look at the rule of law apparatus, and an overall finding is actually that there is no need to reinvent the wheel. That sounds obvious, but you may, if you have followed the rule of law debate in the European Union, there's always the tendency of some member states or some institutions to say, let's create an additional mechanism and yet an additional mechanism and so on. Before you know, it's a total, if you wish, chaos of overlapping mechanisms. Well, we think that actually the existing instruments are, broadly speaking, adequate to uphold the rule of law in the EU and its member states, even though we make a number of recommendations, for instance, regarding the formulation of Article 7 of the TEU. I come to that. So, we think indeed that overall there is no need to change things, but this is of course a critical prerequisite for this finding, is that the existing instruments are actually being used in a prompt, in a forceful, and in a coordinated manner. And that's precisely where the problem lies. That's not the case. A tool that has long been missing in the toolbox, and actually we identified it as Reconnect, was a mechanism aimed at protecting the Union's budget against member states that abuse EU funds to consolidate their backsliding practices. But as you know, that mechanism was precisely adopted in the form of the EU conditionality regulation on the 16th of December 2020, and as you know, only after a very lengthy impasse caused by vetoes by Hungary, Poland, but also, for instance, Slovenia. Now, besides this instrument, and as we have seen, the legality of that instrument has fortunately been cleared by the Court of Justice's aforementioned judgments of the 17th of February. Besides that instrument, Reconnect has also explored the other instruments that are available to the Union in its efforts to at least contain backsliding in member states. The current toolbox, as you may know, consists of Article 7 procedures. I'll come to that. Infringement procedures, both Articles 258-59, the cooperation and verification mechanism, and various soft law instruments, including the rule of law framework and the rule of law review cycle. Let me briefly share some reflections on these instruments. I think, first of all, regarding Article 7, it is an understatement to say that the procedures, because we talk of a plural here, that the procedures of Article 7, which in theory are supposed to resolve breaches of the EU's fundamental values, have turned out to be very difficult to implement in practice. The preventive procedure under Article 7.1 was activated against both Poland and Hungary, but to trigger any sanctions under the so-called sanction procedure of Article 7, paragraph 2, you need the unanimous vote of all member states, apart from the state in question. And it just hasn't happened. While efforts have been made to commence an Article 7.2 procedure against both Poland and Hungary, the procedure has been crippled by the fact that more than one member state has gone the wrong way, right? And when Poland and Hungary are backing each other and prevent a unanimous vote of the member states, then Article 7.2 is basically a procedure that has been left dead in the water, unable to bring a halt to backsliding practices relating to rule of law and democracy. We argue with Reconnect that Article 7 should be used to its full potential, and that actually some changes are needed there. For instance, it should not foresee the participation in 7.2 of a member state that is already subjected to an Article 7.1 procedure. You see what I mean? There are some other changes we suggest in that respect. I come quickly to the unique tool that the EU has at its disposal with the infringement procedures. In the very first place, the Commission's role in Article 258. You know, the Commission can trigger that procedure against any member state considered to have failed in the fulfillment of an obligation under the treaties. And the Commission has indeed initiated proceedings under this article on multiple occasions against both Hungary and Poland. Still, strangely enough, we have found out that overall the Commission's use of infringement procedures has actually been declining in the past 10 years. You should read maybe some of the findings of our colleague from Rutgers University, Professor Dan Keleman, in that respect. Moreover, even in the infringement procedures that have been conducted, the Commission has very often taken a very cautious approach, using rather indirect legal arguments, such as the violation of non-discrimination legislation, even a violation of international rules, such as the GATS, the General Agreement on Trading Services under the WTO, in order to protect the rule of law. Just out of fear also that, invoking Article 2, Article 19 and so on separately may simply not be accepted by the court. And worse, those infringement procedures were only designed to tackle one infringement of EU obligations at a time. Whereas efforts by the governments in question to undermine the rule of law and democratic protections often involve really multiple and systematic infringements of the EU's fundamental values. That's why Reconnect suggests that the Commission should rather also explore the potential of launching interconnected infringement actions based upon multiple articles, including Articles 2, 4, 3, of course, sincere cooperation, Article 19, paragraph 1, and some other treaty articles, maybe also charter articles, to defend judicial independence. I will not dwell really on Article 259, which, as you all know, is about the possibility about member states initiating an infringement actions against another member state. We know that this procedure has been barely used in the past because of its political sensitivity, but there is actually no reason why it cannot be usefully deployed in the context of rule of law backsliding. Member states should actually have an increased awareness of this provision and the possibility to invoke it against other member states. There is interesting news here. I mean, you may recall that in February of last year, the Dutch Parliament approved a motion on the implementation of Article 259 against Poland. And in June of last year, there was a draft motion introduced in the Belgian Federal Parliament as a response to the Hungarian anti-LGBTIQ legislation. Okay, that about treaty aspects. There is soft law. There are useful soft law instruments. The Commission since 2014 has its rule of law framework as a tool, which was viewed by it, at the time at least, as having the potential to act as a kind of simplified pre-Article 7 infringement procedure. It's not the only soft law instrument in the area of rule of law. There is, for instance, since 2013 also the EU Justice Scoreboard, which provides comparable data on the independence, the quality, and the efficiency of national justice systems. As we know, the rule of law framework was used for the first time against Poland in 2016. And although the activation consisted of one formal opinion and 4 formal recommendations, it has had little effect on backsliding practices in Poland. As a result, Commission had no choice but to trigger Article 7.1 TEU. In 2019, the Commission also issued a blueprint for action, again, the tendency of proliferation of mechanisms, in which it set out a new instrument called the Rule of Law Review Cycle. And that review encompasses all member states, not only those with ongoing rule of law concerns. I'm not sure if you have seen the two first reviews, 2020, 2021. I think they have potential, but we have deplored, as Reconnect, the rather euphemistic language. The language that is actually understating the gravity of the situation which is unfolding in multiple member states. And most of all, the failure to recognize the systemic nature of certain developments. It's too easy to say all member states have rule of law challenges. You know, this kind of banalization of the problematic. You have to distinguish maybe a little bit more the really dangerous systemic attacks to the rule of law from structural shortcomings in some member states, although those, of course, also need to be tackled. I come to some recommendations on the rule of law. I just list a couple of them, if I may. The Commission, we think, should focus on improving the current instruments and processes relating to the rule of law framework, bring more audacious infringement cases, and, of course, fully implement the EU conditionality regulation. As I've said in the beginning of my talk, the latter is already seriously under threat now because of the Ukraine crisis. There are some sector-specific recommendations, for instance, in the area of security, justice, and freedom. The Commission, in our view, should introduce a mechanism that is really dedicated to regularly check member states' compliance with the values underlying the mutual trust and put in place measures for an objective and impartial evaluation of the implementation of union policies in this area in order to facilitate the full application of the principle of mutual recognition. I think it's really important because this cannot continue to work with the current tendencies in some member states. The EU Justice Scoreboard is very useful. We think it should be improved, making explicit that there are data gaps because the scoreboard depends on member states' willingness to share information about their judiciaries, and they're not all doing that. So we should identify the data gaps, especially when they result from the unwillingness of national authorities to contribute to the scoreboard. And I think also the Commission should bring more information in there gathered by professional organizations, such as the Venice Commission. We also recommend with Reconnect something about the EU's anti-fraud office, OLAF. We recommend that OLAF findings on corruption, which until now are only communicated discreetly to the member state in question, we recommend to render those findings public when member states are irresponsive to the mischiefs indicated in the reports, and introduce mechanisms of consequences attached to OLAF findings. And then there is also the idea of finding incentives for member states to join the EU Public Prosecutor's Office, a major new innovation with great potential. But you know, it's not something which all member states adhere to. It's not a coincidence, again, that Poland nor Hungary have acceded to it. The most tricky exercise which we are doing currently with regard to Reconnect at the end of our project are possible treaty changes. And that's really difficult. I'm not sure if you yourself are sometimes engaging in that exercises like you as an academic or as a professional. How could or should the treaties be improved? We all know that treaty reform has in itself become some kind of mission impossible in today's European Union. But still, if we academics don't have the courage to think critically about the treaties, who else will do it? So we have a number of treaty changes proposals in the making. I already mentioned to you specifically with regard to Article 7, which again should, in our view, really be implemented more fully. It requires a number of changes both in Article 7.1, Article 7.2. It has to do with a number of things. For instance, clarify the scope of application. Article 7.1 is preventative, fine. But what is this clear risk for a violation? What's the difference with 7.2 and the actual happening of serious violations and so on? The role, for instance, of the European Parliament, which triggered the procedure against Hungary under 7.1, but is not accepted by the Council to really play a role in the actual procedures in the Council. The voting rules, as I said, It's impossible nowadays, with at least 2 member states backing each other up, to adopt any sanctions or findings under 7.2. So we have to go to something else. We are thinking of proposing a supermajority of 4/5 of member states. Again, you will know what happens with those proposed treaty changes. We are even considering suggesting the introduction of a forced expulsion mechanism. Bang! That's a big thing. We have already seen what Article 50 has generated, but still, I mean, you know that expulsion may sometimes, in really structural crisis, think of what happened now with Russia in the Council of Europe, it can sometimes be necessary. I'm also not saying this should be expulsion forever, but, you know, as a last resort, and so on and so forth. There are many more treaty, recommendations, but I'm not going to deal in it. I come to the last part of my presentation, which is enhancing the rule of law in the wider world. And as indicated already, the dynamics of backsliding in democracies and rule of law are absolutely not confined to the borders of the European Union. They reach far beyond. The Union, in a way, is just in interaction with a much larger international environment, which is increasingly characterized by rapid change, instability, very complex dynamics. And again, as demonstrated most shockingly and recently since the 24th of February, the new global reality is increasingly unaligned with the Union's foundational values and constitutional order. It forces the Union to really reflect and find ways and means of mitigating the impacts of these factors for its own internal organization, but also, of course, on how to influence international developments for the better. Again, I should say these dynamics are not entirely new, but they seem to have accelerated somewhat dramatically in recent times. We know already for a number of years that there are external threats to European democracies. They've taken multiple forms, including the deliberate disruptions of elections by third states or by non-state actors, aimed at influencing political systems, processes, institutions at the European, at the member state level, increasing political influence, fragmentation, disunity, distrust, trying to reinforce those tendencies that are actually already present within the EU. There are 2 broader global factors here. The general contestation of the liberal order as a result of the resurgence of authoritarianism in the world and or of populism. And secondly, the great transformation-induced anxiety that has resulted from worldwide issues such as climate change, demographic decline, technological revolutions, pandemics like COVID-19, all of them in a way resulting in a kind of subversion of trust in political institutions. In that challenging environment, which only has become more brutal and cynical in the last 3 weeks, how should the EU act? Notably as far as the promotion of the rule of law in the wider world is concerned. Many speakers yesterday and today have referred to Article 21, Article 3.5, the stated objective in 21 for the EU, and I quote, to advance the rule of law in the wider world. And it's quite something. An constitutional obligation for the Union to spread the rule of law in all of its international relations, actions and policies, the transversal nature of Article 21. I think so. It's not a question of if, it's a question rather of how. How in the current international context can the Union usefully, and I quote again from 21, define and pursue common policies and actions, work for a high degree of cooperation in all fields of international relations in order to consolidate and support democracy, the rule of law, human rights and the principles of international law. All of that beautiful language of Article 21 has become extremely, extremely topical right now. I wish I had more time to develop these fundamental questions. But since I don't have that much time now, I want to briefly develop some reflections on the EU's external relations toolkit and instruments. Now, in particular, I think it's useful to make a bit of a distinction between what I would call the unilateral or autonomous instruments of the EU, the bilateral ones, and the multilateral ones. And you have been touching on all these things, so I'm going to repeat certain things, but just try to put it a bit in a wider framework. In fact, unilaterally, we are really seeing a big boom of tools that are being developed recently also. We discussed them. Think of the EU Magnitsky Act, the EU sanctions with regard to cybersecurity, the proposed anti-coercion instrument, the new unilateral instruments to enforce the respect of international trade rules. Interestingly, also the discussions about the GSP plus, anything but arms, right? Human rights conditionality, which besides the European Commission now is taking more seriously, is enforcing more strictly vis-à-vis third countries. And then what we are currently seeing is amazing. In the past 3 weeks we have seen various phases and stages and ever stronger intensity and extensity of restrictive measures taken against Russia. I think this is very interesting in the sense that they should offer us not just insights in the decision-making processes in the Council. Certainly much more is possible than used to be the case, compared, for instance, to the 2014 reaction to the annexation of Crimea. Much more is possible, apparently. But think of all the complexities involved, right? The scope, the coverage of those sanctions, questions whether they are really effective, whether they are not in some respects already disproportionately affecting certain industries, both in Europe and in Russia, parts of the Russian population. Think also of something quite remarkable, the unprecedented use of the European Peace Facility, which is also a very recent instrument. It's only operational since July 2021, and now suddenly hundreds of millions of euros are being used to basically supply lethal military material to Ukraine. I wonder what the pacifists in Europe will say about all of this. Are we going back in a certain way to the Roman maxim, si vis pacem para bellum? I hope not. But how will this current crisis affect the EU's actions, policies, practices with regard to all these tools and instruments? How will it also have an impact upon the future operationalization, and you know this is coming soon, of the so-called strategic compass? And this is not a complete picture. You may, still speaking of unilateral or autonomous measures, you may want to include also a careful reflection and assessment of past and current initiatives and programs regarding rule of law promotion in countries that were or are candidates for membership, the EU's neighborhood policy, it has been discussed, more widely third countries in the world, where the EU, as you know, contributes with a lot of money to justice reform, to human rights issues, to transitional justice processes. I think we should look more deeply at the use that is being made and that is going to be made of those funding mechanisms regarding external rule of law promotion, especially now that we have a new external instrument, the Neighborhood Development and International Cooperation Instrument, Global Europe, under the new multi-annual budget, as you all know. There's already quite some literature, as we know, and it has been referred to in the past 2 days here, criticizing also the disconnect between the internal policies of the EU and the internal conceptualization of the rule of law and the external actions of the EU. Yes, you talk about different actors in a certain way. People in the EAS do not always know what people in other DGs in the Commission are doing, and so on and so forth. So there is a need of getting our act really much more together. This brings me to the bilateral level, and again, it's things we have touched upon. There is, of course, a considerable acquis of rule of law promotion in the international agreements that the EU has concluded with lots of third countries, from strategic trading partners such as Canada, Japan and South Korea, to the ACP countries. But these treaty frameworks, in my view, valuable as they may be, may need to be optimized for all the changes that we're seeing in the world. Not just to deepen our mutual commitment to rule of law and democracy, but also to deepen or to at least forge a stronger consensus on the way forward for the rule of law, not just within the EU, within those partner countries, but also regarding the joint promotion of rule of law within international organizations, international universal organizations from the UN to the WTO, but also regional and cross-regional organizations. And think also about the potential, although you can be very cynical about them, but I've always liked the so-called human rights dialogues between the EU and around 100 countries in the world. Very difficult. I've been myself an expert in some of those human rights dialogues, especially between the EU and China, and I can tell you stories that you would simply not believe. Last but not least, there is the Union's multilateral engagement and promotion of the rule of law, in particular at the United Nations. Well, there is something out there, many have forgotten about it, but there is a September 2012 declaration of the high-level meeting of the General Assembly on the rule of law at national and international levels. You may smile at it, say, people have forgotten about that. But in fact, at the time, it was a major breakthrough, and the EU worked very hard to make it a meaningful instrument. And if you reread the paragraphs of that declaration, there's a lot of food and thought in it, and it has actually still an untapped potential. It's become a little bit forgotten because we had the 2015 Sustainable Development Goals, Agenda 2030, and so on and so forth, but still at the time were many pledges, commitments made, follow-up mechanisms that were going to be provided by the UN, and so on. And I think you should revisit that high-level declaration, especially with all the current challenges. I'm pretty sure that such a declaration could not be arrived at anymore in today's international context. But we have it. It's there since 2012. We should also reflect on how to improve our actions within the multilateral bodies that deal with issues of rule of law and human rights. And that's a big discussion. You can go from the Venice Commission, Council of Europe, to the global level. Think of the enormous contestation and actions, cleavages also, within the UN Human Rights Council, the Third Committee of the General Assembly in New York. But still, there is, in my view, a glimmer of hope. And I'm not sure if you're sharing it with me, but I have been very positively surprised to see in the past couple of weeks that the united system is actually still working in the face of Russia's aggression. Of course, the Security Council was not able to do anything for the well-known reasons. Strangely enough, that same Security Council has referred the matter under the Uniting for Peace mechanisms to the General Assembly, and then on the 1st of March, we saw the adoption of a General Assembly resolution that I recommend really reading to all of you, adopted with a very strong majority, 141 countries in favor, and really calling things by their name, explicitly condemning Russia for its aggression and invasion and the use of force. Well, I'm not sure if you have compared this, but in 2014 the General Assembly also adopted a resolution at the occasion of the annexation of Crimea. That was a very meek resolution, had a much lower number of member states supporting it, only slightly more than 100. And moreover, it didn't even call Russia by name, So I'm very happy that now, at least in 2022, the General Assembly has been much more forceful about that. And again, two days ago, the ICJ, the International Court of Justice, giving a rather forceful and remarkable order against Russia. So in that sense, the system is not broke. It can work. And of course, as we all know from all the past systemic challenges to international law, from 9/11 to what we are seeing since 24th of February, international law and international organizations are decidedly vulnerable to the brutality of big powers. But they also tend to show a resilience that is very often underestimated. And given the EU treaty commitment, again in the beautiful long Article 21, that the EU, and I quote, shall promote multilateral solutions to common problems, in particular in the framework of the United Nations, we can, and I think we should continue with the EU to work through multilateral channels at the regional, cross-regional and universal levels to promote the rule of law in what is increasingly a lawless environment. Doggedly, but in a determined manner. In the spirit of Guillaume le Taciturne, point n'est besoin d'espérer pour entreprendre, ni de réussir pour persévérer. Or to come back to my biblical language, for me the message for the European Union's rule of law promotion in international affairs should be Duc in altum. Thank you very much.